Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
All right. So my name is Megan. I am the Adult Services Librarian here at C.C. Mellor Library. And we are going to wait a couple minutes here and let some stragglers come in because I know we sold out for this program, so we should have about 30 people. So we're going to let those stragglers come on in. But in the meantime, I will give my little library spiel. This is presented by C.C. Mellor Library in conjunction with Crust Worthy Bakery. And the library is back open again. We're open 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, 12 to 6. So if you want to come bring your books back that you've had since February, check out some new books, use a computer. We're doing more virtual programs like this as well. So you can sign up for our email newsletter to find out more about those. You follow us on social media, which is at CC Mellor Library on Facebook and Instagram. We're pretty active on there. So if you're looking to hear about what's going on at the library, that's a good way. You can visit our website, ccmellorlibrary.org. We always put everything up on there as well. That's pretty much it. We are happy to be open again and excited to see everyone's bright, shining, beautiful faces with a mask on, of course. But so looks like we got a good crowd coming in. So I think we can probably go ahead and get started, Chloe, if you're good to go.
Yeah. Thank you.
So go right ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Megan, for hosting this and putting it together. I know I'm personally super excited to have library access again. I definitely had books from February that I had to bring back, but was happy to trade them in for some really awesome science fiction books that I'm now deep into. But anyway, my name's Chloe. I'm the head baker, owner, founder of Crust Worthy Bakery. And Crust Worthy is a small-scale, community-supported artisan baking operation. Technically, I don't have a storefront or a permanent location. I'm currently baking out of rented commercial space and working on my own production space that's almost finished. The pandemic slowed down a few things, but we're getting there. My baking operation, or bakery, whatever you want to call it, uses wholesome ingredients, natural leavening, also known as sourdough, and slow fermentation methods, which is sourdough, to provide delicious, nutritious, and uniquely beautiful sourdough breads and baked goods to Pittsburgh local customers. I also promote socially and environmentally sustainable baking, which sourdough goes hand in hand in. You may also have heard sourdough called wild occurring yeasts, cultures. It's kind of a mixture of bacteria and yeast that we'll get into. I also source organic and local ingredients, purchasing from and collaborating with local farmers and producers, other businesses. I engage in local and community and educational events, such as this one, and offer allergen-friendly products, including a lot of nut-free, peanut-free, vegan, vegetarian options for people, mostly through the farmers markets at the current moment. Hoping to offer more in the winter months as we get our production space set up, but we're just kind of playing it all by ear right now, as I'm sure a lot of you are also doing in your own lives. So today's program is centered around having a sourdough starter and keeping it healthy and happy at home so that you can use it for sourdough bread or for other kinds of sourdough baking projects. First, I just wanted to go over a little bit about what sourdough actually is, because it's a really kind of mysterious substance that people don't really understand that much about when you're first starting out. So it's actually a culture. Sourdough is a sort of symbiotic relationship between bacteria and yeast that are living within a flour and water mixture. So the whole thing is just comprised of flour and water that you mix together, and the wild occurring bacteria and yeasts form their home in there, and that's where you get all of that acidity and bubbly action. All of the magic happens right in there. That's where you are starting your bread. Of course, a lot of people before they've baked with sourdough have experimented with bread by using commercial yeast that's related, but they are different, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So what do the bacteria and yeast do in sourdough? The bacteria is responsible for taking those sugars and starches that are food within flour naturally, and they turn them into lactic acid. That's where the sour flavor comes from in sourdough. It's also what creates a really acidic environment that prevents other harmful microbes from living in that culture. So there's really only the wild bacteria and wild yeast that prefer to live in that highly acidic flour-water mixture. There shouldn't be any kind of mold or other harmful, crazy microbes coming in. It can be a little weird to start something wild, but know that it should be a generally safe environment because the bacteria is creating such an acidic place that only one kind of yeast wants to live in. And that yeast is responsible for the signature flavor and smell of sourdough, and it also creates the carbon dioxide, which forms little bubbles within the starter, creating rise and texture in the bread. So why do we bake with sourdough anyway? If we have commercial yeast available, it seems like commercial yeast is a much easier way to go. It's under normal circumstances readily available. But of course, many of you may be interested in it now because there are shortages around the world. But there are more reasons than that, it turns out. Sourdough creates a really digestible kind of loaf. It's the way that our ancestors have been baking bread for thousands of years. It creates a lot more nutrient availability within the loaf. Commercially produced yeast products often will have, or rather they'll lack the kind of bioavailability of different nutrients that you could be getting from a loaf of bread, whereas sourdough kind of unlocks it through this slow fermentation method. Similar to if you are someone who soaks your legumes, your dry beans, your lentils before you use them, or if you're into soaking nuts and seeds, it's that same kind of unlocking, so to speak, of nutrients that sourdough will also do for you in your loaf of bread. In a similar note, sourdough bread generally has a lower glycemic index than commercially produced bread. Of course, it has that awesome flavor that is, I think, unfairly called sour, because not all sourdough breads are sour, but it is something truly unique to sourdough. And it also has natural preservatives in it, so it has a longer shelf life than commercially produced breads without any added preservatives. So those are just a few of the reasons that I think sourdough baking is worthwhile and something to be promoted. Of course, there are probably other ones out there as well, but those are the ones that I like to share in workshops like these. So let's get started on making our own sourdough starter. You can actually just do it from your home kitchen with only flour, water, and a container. That's really all you need. Whatever kind of flour you have on hand is generally okay. You can use all-purpose flour, whole wheat flour, bread flour. You can even use pastry flour. Generally, I would recommend staying away from flours that might be bleached, or it might say enriched on the packaging. Those basically just mean that it's been either hyper processed or it has some things added to it that might interfere with the fermentation. I would recommend looking for King Arthur flour. They have pretty good flours to choose from, or just checking around at your local health food store or online. You might find flours that match that description. But even with enriched and bleached flours, you might be able to get a starter going, since we are just trying to create an environment that wild microbes like. Generally, I like to use whole wheat flour. I've started using that in my own sourdough starter. It does create a more active environment because there are more nutrients that the microbes like to eat very quickly. So if you are using whole wheat flour, you may be able to get your starter started faster. But if you're using bread flour, like white bread flour or all-purpose flour, that's fine too. You'll still get a really nice, bubbly, active starter. And a lot of bakeries use just white flour in their starter. A lot of bakeries use just whole wheat flour. Spelt flour is another one. I just saw that question pop up. But yeah, spelt flour is wonderful. Spelt can come in whole or white varieties. Just the level of processing and how much bran is included. But that's a really fun one to use as well. So once you have your flour picked out and you have some water nearby, you have to figure out what kind of a container you're going to use. I recommend picking a container that is clear. That way you are able to watch the fermentation as it's happening and monitor it. You'll be able to see the rise and fall once you start to invite those microbes in and create a culture. And yeah, it's just a lot more fun that way. You can use plastic or glass, ceramic if you choose not to do something that's clear. The only material that I would recommend not using is metal, because metal has been known to interfere with fermentation. It can make weird stuff happen, so just try to not use metal. But something like a mason jar works great. It doesn't have to be anything super fancy. It can be even just like a drinking glass if you have one. But mason jars are nice because, especially the wide mouth ones, they just are really easy to stir and get stuff out. There was a little bit of water in that one that I just spilled on myself, sorry. And you can see through it pretty quickly. It's even got lines on the side, so you can kind of monitor the rise and fall pretty easily. Yeah, easy to clean, and it has a nice weight to it, so it's not too difficult to, or rather, yeah, it's not too easy to knock over. But you could also use something that's plastic if you prefer, like a Tupperware is fine. So it's up to you. Once you have your container selected, if you have a digital scale at home, I would recommend using it. It's just a really good practice to get into whenever you're baking with sourdough bread. You'll find a lot of recipes use grams for measurements, just to have an exact method moving forward. And it kind of makes the whole process easier, I think. It just makes the sourdough feeding process really quick. One bowl, no spoons needed, just something to mix with. If you don't have a measuring scale, that's okay. You can get one online if you decide you want one, or you can use just regular measuring spoons that you have at home. And that's totally fine. I'll go over what kinds of measurements you'll want to use with that.
Chloe, we've got a question in the chat about whether different flours affect the flavor of the sourdough.
Yeah, great question. The flours definitely will affect the flavor of the sourdough. If you are using, for example, a rye starter and you use it in a wheat sourdough, that rye flour that's in the starter is going to come through in the resulting bread. Even if you aren't adding any more rye flour, rye in particular is a really strong flour flavor, and you would be able to detect it in the final bread. And yeah, you could totally experiment and play around with different flours in your starter, different flours in your bread to see what works best and what you like the most. But just know that the flour will affect the flavor in the end. You can always try to accommodate for this if you want to change the flour amounts that are in your dough recipe according to what flours are in your starter, or you can just roll with it, and that's perfectly fine too. So yeah, if you want to try something like rye or spelt, I say go for it. The I do want to make a note about non-gluten containing flours such as buckwheat or millet flour, sorghum flour. Those would be a little problematic if you're just starting out with wheat sourdough because they don't contain gluten. You can create a gluten-free sourdough for gluten-free recipes, but I would just consider that in an entirely different category for now. So for starting out, I recommend rye, wheat of any kind of whole or white variety, or spelt flour is a great place to start too. So I do have a measuring scale that I like to use. I think I got it for $10 online, and it works well enough. If you have your scale, I would recommend grabbing it now if you want to follow along. I have my container, and the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that my scale is set to 0. So it says, and it's in grams. We're going to be using all grams today just because that's, again, what most sourdough bakers use. It's what you'll find in most recipes online or in cookbooks. So 0 grams is where we're starting. I have my container and I'm putting it on the scale. My mason jar, it turns out, weighs 285 grams. I would recommend either writing down what your container weighs, or like writing it down in a notebook, memorizing it, or writing it actually on the container, maybe on a piece of tape, just so that you know what the starting weight of your container is. And that'll be really helpful moving forward so that you are able to know how much starter in total is in your container. So putting it back on the scale shows up as 285 grams. And now I'm going to press the tare button, which essentially just means that you're going to completely zero it out, start from 0. There we go. I'm going to be using bread flour today, and I only have a little bit left in my jar, but that's okay because we're just starting out. So when you're first starting out, we're going to start with 50 grams of flour. And here we go. Almost. And it's not going to look like that much. You really don't need that much starter for bread, for like 1 loaf of bread. But especially not right now. We're going to keep the amount small because we're going to be doing a process of feeding and taking out, feeding and taking out. So you don't want to waste too much starter. Now, again, I'm going to zero out. Oh, and we're looking for measuring cup or spoon amounts. I would say just start with about 2 tablespoons, or let's see what we have here. 4 ounces. I would start out with, say, about 3 tablespoons of flour. And the important part here is not so much of using X amount, or, you know, like it doesn't have to be the exact amount that I have in my cup right now. It's more about having consistency and having the ratio correct, the ratio of flour to water. So for measuring spoon, people at home, start out with about 3 tablespoons of flour, and then you'll want to add just under 3 tablespoons of water. And the reason for that is that the gram measurement, the mass of water is slightly less in volume than that of flour. So just make it like slightly below the tablespoon line. And you'll find as you're mixing it, if it seems too dry, like there's not enough water, which you'll be able to tell from doing it over and over again. And also I'll kind of give you a sense of it as we go through it farther. You can always add a little bit more water in. It's just easier to add water in than to, well, to take it out or to add more flour in. So starting again with about 3 tablespoons of flour or 50 grams on the scale, we're going to add just under 3 tablespoons of water or 50 grams of water. There we go. So I have it in here. I'm just using a knife. You can also use your fingers or a spoon. I kind of like using my fingers or my hand because then I get a sense of what it feels like, and I can also feel if there are any pockets of flour that I haven't hit easier. So mixing it up, and I can see that it's already kind of turning goopy, kind of sticky, especially with bread flour. If you're using a whole wheat flour, it's gonna feel a little bit more grainy, obviously. But this is what mine looks like right now. It's somewhere between like paste and pancake batter, I would say. And I'm really trying to hydrate the flour as much as possible and incorporate some air in there. Just make it a really nice environment where some microbes are going to want to live. Once I have that nice and stirred up, and I've cleaned the edges a little bit, but I'm not too worried about it. You can kind of see where the flour and water mixture level is. When I'm first starting out, I really like to use a rubber band around the container so that I can see where that initial level is. And
we've got a question about how much water in grams. Is that 50 grams water, 50 grams flour?
Yeah, we're gonna do equal amounts, 50 and 50 in grams. Just a little bit to start out. So this is considered the first feeding, right? Day one, we have our starter started. You're probably not gonna see too much activity on day one. It's really not until days 3 or 4 possibly that you might even see a little bit of bubbles, and so don't worry too much about monitoring it on that first day. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So with your container, you do want to cover it, but you don't want to cover it too tightly. I like the mason jar because they come with the lid and the screw on, and you can just place that first part of the lid on and let it sit there, and it'll be loose enough that air can still get out as carbon dioxide is being produced, but it's not going to let in bugs or dirt. So it's kind of perfect that way. If you don't have a lid for a mason jar or you're using something else, you can use a cloth. You can just place it on top. You can also put a rubber band around the top if you are concerned that it's going to blow off or get knocked off. If you're using Tupperware, you can use the Tupperware top and just place it, or only close it on one side and kind of leave a little bit of it not closed. So it's just whatever you would like to do. On day 2, basically you're just letting it sit overnight. You're not going to worry about it anymore. Leave it on your counter, on top of your fridge, wherever it's out of the way. On day 2, you are going to remove most of what you put in. So if you added in 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water, that means your total mass of starter is 100 grams. You're going to take out 75 grams of that 100 grams. What you do with it is kind of up to you. You can save it and you can use it in other recipes. There are great recipes online for what's called sourdough discard. That just basically means if you're taking starter out and don't want to use it in bread, you can use it. Ooh, that was music. You can use it for pancakes, waffles, taco shells. There are just tons and tons of ways to use this flour and water mixture without using it for bread if it's not ready yet, or if you just don't feel like making bread that day. And you can just literally put it into a container, a Tupperware in your fridge, and put it in your fridge and leave it for a while, and it'll be fine. It's just flour and water, so don't worry about it. You can also just compost it if you're not worried about using it up. So those are my recommended ways of dealing with that. Again, we're going to take the 75 grams out, which leaves you with 25 grams of starter. And you're going to do the same feeding. 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water are going to go back into the jar, and you're going to mix it up with the leftover starter that you had from day one. So now you're going to end up with 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water fresh, and the 25 grams from before, for a total of 125 grams of starter. That's day 2. You're going to cover it, leave it, forget about it. On day 3, you're going to take out 100 again, back down to, you're going to take down 100 rather than 75. You're going to be left with 25 again, and you're going to repeat that feeding of 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. And you're going to repeat that pattern on day 3 for the remainder of days. It may take 5 days, it may take 7 days for you to get a really active starter, one that is consistently rising and falling and getting lots of nice bubbles and a really nice smell. That's going to depend on the temperature of your house, the environment, the flour that you're using, how old the flour is. It's kind of a luck of the draw in some ways because it is wild microbes. But eventually, the idea is that you create an environment where bacteria and yeast, bacteria that are producing acid, where the yeast really like it, but nothing else likes it, are living together harmoniously and creating a bubbly, sticky mess. And it'll look something like this, if you can see. This is a whole wheat starter. It has a really nice kind of like cheesy, yeasty smell. I don't smell anything like super vinegary. If it gets that way, it's not a big deal, but it just means that it's been producing a lot of acid, so it's pretty hungry and it needs to be fed again. But that's the basic way of how to start a starter from scratch. You're just keeping a small amount every time and feeding it with fresh flour and water. Do I remove every day? Yes, so the idea is to leave behind 25 grams of starter every day. And as you are using your starter in the future to bake bread or use it for other recipes, you always want to remain, you always want to have a little bit of starter left over that you'll feed and create more with again. So you really are kind of like keeping a pet and feeding it, making it bigger every time. The reason why we have to take some out is so that we don't end up with too much starter. Because if you are feeding your starter 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water every day, you can tell it's going to outgrow this container very quickly. It's also not going to be the healthiest. And the reason for that is that you want to try to feed your starter enough flour and water compared to the amount that you have. So having 25 grams of starter and feeding it twice as much flour and twice as much water, right? 25 grams of starter to 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. That's a really nice healthy ratio for feeding. You could also go as low as a 1-to-1-to-1, where you have 25 grams of starter, 25 grams of flour, and 25 grams of water, and that would be fine. I would not recommend going any lower than that though, because your starter is essentially not going to have enough food to eat. And if anyone else knows what it's like to not have enough food to eat, you know that you don't perform as well. Maybe you yourself get a little sour. So to have a healthy starter, you really want to be giving it enough food. I've gotten the question before, is it possible to overfeed your starter? You know, say you have 2 grams of starter and you feed it 1,000 grams of flour and water. I would say that's perfectly fine. It's really not easy to overfeed your starter in any one feeding. The only thing is that it's probably going to take a lot more time for your starter to reach its peak activity to a point where you're going to be able to use it for bread. But it will still be fine and very well fed. So I think
I'm going to jump in here with a question, Chloe, actually. My kitchen currently is 1,000 degrees because I don't have any air conditioning. Is there an ideal temperature range to keep your starter happy?
That's a great question. I think ideally for sourdough starter and human scheduling, 75 degrees or 80 degrees even is like around the area where your sourdough will be happy on a 24-hour feeding schedule so that you don't have to feed it more than once a day. In the winter, when things get colder, you might find that you only have to feed your starter every other day. Or in the summer, if your house is really hot, I get it. My house is also pretty hot. And the bakery area, don't even get me started. But you may have to feed it multiple times a day, or you may have to find other ways to keep that starter at a lower temperature. Some people keep their flour refrigerated or use really cold water, and that works out well. Over time, you know, as it heats up, it'll start to get more active, but good to know just how temperature is going to affect the starter. If you do start looking for recipes for baking bread, you'll see a lot of them do specify temperature of the house, temperature of the water. So just be aware of that and know that that can really speed up or slow down things very quickly. It's definitely something I've been fighting against this year, and something that is just kind of part of it.
We've got another question a couple questions in the chat. When do you know when you have to feed the starter? What are the cues to pay attention to?
Yeah, so once you get your starter active and healthy and you're able to kind of predict when it'll be rising and falling, once your sourdough starter gets to its highest part, that's called peak, that's when you would really like to use it. Of course, it's not always possible that the starter is ready when you are, so don't worry about it if you're missing that peak a little bit. Just try to plan for it next time if you can. But also, once it starts to fall back down, you can still use it. It might just take a little bit longer for your bread to leaven the way that you want it to. Your starter might also be a little bit more sour at that point, so your bread might be a little more sour as well. But once it does start to fall down, after a certain point, you'll notice the smell. You'll see that it doesn't have as many bubbles in it. Maybe it's become a little bit more liquidy. It's all of these signs that'll tell you that it's time to feed your starter. Yeah, usually, again, the rubber band is really helpful for this. Once you see that you know, your starter has gone up and come back down, it may be a little bit above the rubber band, but you'll see also on the side of your container that it had been higher. So you can do it on a 24-hour schedule. Seems to work pretty well under most conditions. Someone also in the chat I see was asking about storage in the fridge. That's a great long-term storage idea. If you are not baking sourdough every day like crazy people, you can feed your starter as regularly. You can feed your starter as you normally would, and then immediately put it in the fridge. And what that does is it cools it down so much that the fermentation isn't stopped, but it's slowed. So it'll feed over that next week or so on that one feeding. I've honestly even kept starter in the fridge for months at a time and taken it out and fed it, and it comes back to life within a few feedings. So you can really use the fridge to your advantage if you're not baking every day or don't want to feed it every day. You can even freeze bits of starter. I wouldn't recommend doing this for too long because it does kill off the yeast and bacteria over time, but it can be helpful if you're going a few months at a time without using it. You can also dehydrate starter and use that for long-term storage. You can use cold water from the refrigerator dispenser, I believe. I would just recommend, as long as your dispenser doesn't add in too many crazy things. If it's filtered water, that's great, that's fine. I'm just not sure if the dispenser would add anything to it. I don't think they usually do. I think they mostly would just filter out. So that would be perfectly fine. If you do some research online about can I use tap water or not for sourdough. The main consensus is that some cities do add in a lot of stuff into tap water that most people aren't comfortable with. I personally drink Pittsburgh tap water. Sorry, it's weird, but I do. And my starter also drinks the tap water. So I think it's okay. I think it doesn't interfere with the fermentation too much. If you prefer to use filtered water, that is totally fine, and you can do that. I think it's mostly just too much chlorine in the water can affect it. But yeah, cold water would be fine. In the winter, that might pose a problem because it might just be really slow fermentation. But if you learn, again, like if you watch it and you get to know what its cycles are, you might even be able to use that to your advantage if you want to delay the fermentation so that you can bake bread, you know, the next morning or later on in the day rather than too soon.
All right, I don't know, do we have, oh, we've got another question. How much starter do you generally use for a basic bread recipe?
Good question. So for a lot of starting bread recipes, if anyone just decides to take out like the tartine bread book, that's a really popular starting one. I think his ratio is about 100 grams of starter per loaf. A lot of his recipes are actually to build enough dough for 2 loaves at a time. The sourdough baking process is really long, so it's usually a good idea to want to make more than 1 loaf at a time just because it is such an involved process, and it's not that much more work to do 2 rather than 1. So I think his recipes, yeah, they were like 200 grams of starter total, which is 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. And then you would add in about, I want to say like 900-ish grams of flour, or maybe even 1,000 grams of flour to 700 grams of water. So you're ending up with about 1,000-gram loaves in the end.
Another question from the chat. Do you ever mix together different kinds of flour to experiment with flavor?
Yeah, absolutely. I love playing with different kinds of flour. I source most of my flour personally from Frankfurt Farms because I'm buying a lot of flour at a time, and they have really wonderful freshly milled flour options from local growers and different kinds of grains. I'm a huge supporter of grain diversity and not just using white wheat. I have really loved experimenting with barley flour this year, with buckwheat, with rye. I love using spelt flour, that came up earlier, and they all have different properties. They all act differently, so be aware of that. I mean, there are plenty of ones out there. You could even experiment with ancient grains, which are sort of getting a bit more more news on them lately. Those are essentially varieties of wheat flours that our ancestors were using and have kind of remained unchanged for a very, very long time. So it's pretty cool to replicate ancient breads and discover what kinds of flavors were possible back then and possible now. Yeah, some examples of those would have been like einkorn, emmer flour, kemet. There's just tons of different things to experiment with, tons of different varieties of wheat and other grains too.
I'm going to jump in with another question of mine because this entire program is just because I want to know about baking more. So I do mostly pastry baking, and I know that you've done some really excellent sourdough cookies, but I don't really know. I don't have any experience with baking yeasted pastries. So do you find that there's a really big difference? Like, do you need to? Is the process for baking pastry with sourdough significantly different?
So I do have some pastries that are leavened with sourdough. I use, for example, a whole grain cinnamon roll that is completely leavened with sourdough, and it is not sour, it's just really flavorful. And I also have pastries where I include some sourdough starter. This is where I would use sourdough discard to incorporate into a different recipe. And that is kind of where that idea was born out of, is that I was getting all of the sourdough discard because I wasn't being very cognizant of how much starter I needed for how much bread. So I always overestimated, and I always had too much starter on hand, and I couldn't eat any more pancakes. So I took my discard and I threw it into different kinds of pastry recipes, and it turned out that they were really, really good. The starter adds this sort of umami flavor, and the only thing that I had to account for was the acidity. So rather than using vinegar in a lot of like cookie or muffin recipes, I would instead incorporate sourdough starter. I would adjust my flour and water accordingly. And then the acid that is in the sourdough starter would react with leaveners such as baking powder, baking soda, to create the same kind of cookie and muffin, but just with a different kind of spin on it. Leaving those batters and doughs in the fridge allows them to also have those benefits from slow fermentation, a little bit more flavor, a little bit more digestibility. So there are definitely ways to bake with pastries, both for leavening and both for, just to have it as extra flavor.
All right, more questions from the chat. Can you control how sour the starter gets? Can it get too sour?
So you can control how sour the starter gets. You can use what is called a young starter, which is when the starter is still gaining momentum, right? Like it hasn't hit its peak yet, but it's getting up there. You can use a young starter to have a less sour dough. You can also use a mature starter, which is at its peak or even beyond its peak, to have a more sour sourdough. Again, these are going to have different fermentation speeds once you are actually building your dough. And you can find different recipes that will call for a young starter or a mature starter to play around with that and see what you like. A lot of times the kinds of flours that you're using will contribute to how sour your starter is. As far as can it get too sour, probably. You could definitely leave your starter for too long and it starts to create what is called hooch. The hooch is a layer of gray liquid on top, and it can be really scary when you first see it, but your starter isn't sick, it's just really hungry, and it's a totally natural thing. And whenever that happens, you can just stir it back in and feed it as normal. You could pour off the liquid if you prefer and just feed as normal. But it's not anything to worry about. It happens a lot, especially if you're keeping your discard in your fridge and you don't know, like you're not using it right away. But you can just always stir it back in as long as there isn't, any kind of mold or anything growing on top of it. Most breads are made more sour, I will say, by the fermentation that happens after the starter is added. So there are ways to play with the starter where you're trying to create a more sour bread, but usually it's more about refrigerating the dough for multiple days. That gets into some more advanced techniques. I get a lot of people who say, like, I tried to make sourdough, but it wasn't sour. I want to make it more sour. And that it comes from experience, and it comes from kind of pushing the limits of fermentation once you are actually working with the dough. But it can be done. Yeah.
All right. So if you want to bake a spelt sourdough bread, do you use the basic starter and then add the spelt flour when you get ready to make the bread, or do you need to make a separate spelt starter? Say that 5 times fast. Separate spelt starter.
So you can use a regular wheat starter for a spelt bread. Absolutely. I do that in my own bakery. I generally keep one basic starter that I use for most of my recipes. And then if I'm making a spelt bread, I use that wheat flour starter for my spelt flour bread. Or if you prefer, you can actually train your starter onto a different flour, especially if you want to use it for a 100% spelt flour starter or a 100% whole wheat flour bread. All you have to do is just kind of start, you can kind of wean it onto these other flours by starting to incorporate more spelt flour and less of the wheat flour each feeding. It's not, I mean, it's up to you if you'd like to experiment with that, but you can definitely just keep one starter going if you prefer, and it can be wheat or spelt, all of the time, and you can use it for different kinds of breads. I think with certain breads, if you're using, for example, a rye starter versus a wheat starter, the properties are going to be very different in the final bread. But with a spelt and a wheat starter, those differences might be less noticeable.
So that kind of brings us into another question in the chat, which I think you kind of just answered, but do you have to keep feeding the starter the same flour that you used in the first place, or can you use a different flour?
Yeah, you can definitely use a different flour, throughout the starter's lifetime. This whole wheat flour that whole wheat starter that I had started out as a plain white flour starter. I've also used it to create a rye starter by training it onto that flour, and that lives in the fridge when I'm not using it, and then I feed it and bring it back up to speed. Granted, none of these starters are technically 100% of whatever they are, because they are all born from the same white wheat flour. So if I were to create a gluten-free starter out of my wheat starter, it would totally not be good to use for someone who has celiacs, but it would still thrive. I still could create something that thrives off of buckwheat or millet. You can feed it with kind of whatever flour you have on hand. But there may be a little bit of a transition period where your starter might not be acting super normally whenever you start to change up the flours too much. It just likes consistency. That's the main idea, is to give it some kind of consistency.
Is there any ratio that we can use to know the equivalent between commercial yeast and sourdough? Is there like a good conversion?
Good question. I don't entirely know. There might be, but most of the time it depends on what you want the final product to be, what other ingredients are involved. If it's an enriched dough, which means it has like eggs and maybe milk or butter in it, that can affect wild fermentation. How much water is involved, because there is water in the starter as well. So it can be kind of tricky, and it requires a little bit of experimentation usually anytime that you want to switch a commercially yeasted recipe over to a sourdough recipe. I would say just play around. And if you find a good conversion, let me know. That sounds great.
Where can we go to find good sourdough recipes online or offline? You had mentioned a cookbook earlier.
Yeah, so I do get a lot of cookbooks from the library. Some of my favorite sourdough authors to start out with, maybe I can just type them in the chat so that, I don't know, I feel like sometimes, is it working? Oh, hang on one second. So Ken Forkish has a great book. I think it's called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast. And he does some pizza recipes, a lot of great starting bread recipes. He has a great backstory. A lot of these bread bakers that I started out with all started from completely different walks of life and ended up with bread, which I love. Ken Forkish, also Chad Robertson does Tartine, which is the book that I mentioned earlier with the basic sourdough loaf that has the 200 grams of starter and 1,000 grams of flour, that whole thing. He has a really successful business out in California now, and you can find a lot of inspiration from him. One of my absolute favorite is Sarah C. Owens. She has an incredible approach to sourdough baking and to seasonal ingredients, and just a wonderful approach to the kitchen. But her sourdough books are really great for beginners. Yeah, you can just go onto the library site and type in sourdough and you'll get a bunch of stuff to come up. I mean, this is how I found these ones. And as far as online, there's a website called The Perfect Loaf that has a lot of experimentation and great methodology, especially if you want to get pretty scientific about it and do a lot of more meticulous note-taking. You can tell this guy who does it has a really detail-oriented approach to sourdough. Cultures for Health is another website that you can check out. They have a lot of great sourdough discard recipes. Yeah, I think that's a good place to start out, online and with the library.
And we are more than happy to put whatever sourdough bakery baking books on hold for you. Call us up, ask for me. I'll hook you up. It'll be great. We've got another question in the chat. I'm worried about food safety. What are some of the things that we should look for? You had mentioned mold.
Yeah, so the reason why I mentioned mold was mostly when you put your starter away for a very long time, right? And maybe you're putting it in the fridge where there might be other things floating around, and your starter isn't as active. It's not, it's not creating that environment anymore where other microbes aren't going to want to come in. That's the only time where you really have to look out for anything dangerous or that might cause sickness. But in general, the flour and water mixture with the bacteria and yeast involved, once it's going and healthy, there's not going to be anything else in there that's going to want to live in that highly acidic environment. The strain of yeast that can survive in it is, although the name of it specifically, I cannot remember right now, but it's the only thing that wants to live in there. So you're going to have a pretty safe environment. And as long as you keep it covered, for the most part, you're not going to have anything falling in there, no cat hair or dirt, no bugs. It should be a fairly safe way to go, I would say.
All right, so this is going to be our last question because we are coming up on our time here. Do we need to keep the starter in the refrigerator after the 4th day?
After the 4th day, I would say you're probably going to want to keep feeding it on that schedule. It does require a little bit of care and love, for that first week. It needs a feeding just about every day. It may even take longer than 7 days, depending on, the flour that you're using, the environment that you're in your home. So I wouldn't recommend putting your starter in the fridge until you really have it going and vigorous. And, maybe try to bake with it a few times and see what's happening. After you have it nice and vigorous, rising and falling predictably, really nice smells, then I would say it would be safe to put in the refrigerator. And when I say safe, I don't mean for food safety. I mean it'll be easy to get it going again and to keep it healthy if you put it in the fridge only after you've really gotten it nice and established. And again, the process for putting it in the fridge is to give it a regular feeding as usual, as though you're going to leave it out. But rather than just leaving it on the counter after you feed it, put it into the fridge, and then it'll work slowly through that feeding.
All right. Well, I think that is going to be it for us. We're coming up on our time. But Chloe, tell us where we can find you out and about in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, you can find me and my partner working at farmers markets. We are at the Bloomfield Farmers Markets on Saturdays. That's from 9 to 1. We are at the Squirrel Hill Market every other week, so we won't be there this Sunday, but we'll be there next Sunday. And the Lawrenceville Market also every other Tuesday, which means that we will be there this Tuesday. We weren't there yesterday. You can follow me online. That's probably the easiest way to figure out my crazy schedule. And you can also order online from me that way. crustworthypgh.com, or you can follow me on Instagram or Facebook, where it's crustworthy.pgh. And I don't currently ship loaves, sorry. But thank you so much for all of the wonderful feedback that's coming up in this chat right now. I would love to share bread with all of you folks. And we also do, of course, sourdough pastries, which are really fun and tasty. And we do a lot of seasonal products that change out every week. So stop by every week and find out what we have.